Well, thanks, Mr. D'Ambrosio from Calgary. Clearly, a Prime Minister needs to reassure the Canadian public that there is a difference between the crisis in the United States and what we're experiencing here. But equally clearly, the United States is heading for a recession, is already in a recession. Canada's economic health needs to be buttressed quickly. First thing I would do is put a freeze on the takeover of our corporations. We've lost Inco, Falconbridge, Hudson Bay. We need to protect our corporations because the foreign direct investment there is actually driving up the Canadian dollar. We need to take steps to reduce the dollar's value against the United States so that we can drive up our export-driven industries, protecting the manufacturing sector, forestry, and we need to look long-term, to invest in sustainable jobs, to invest in Canada so that it's not just the short-term we look after, but our kids' economy and our future. With all due respect, Mr. Harper, you're the one who asked for the expanded time on the economy last night and tonight. Both nights I was waiting to hear what you thought you should do about the situation. I wondered why you even wanted the time on the economy last night, because you offered nothing up. And again tonight, you've spent your time attacking the policies of others and saying, look at their platform. Well, where's your platform? Yours is the only party that hasn't put forward any platform yet in this election. All the other parties have. And I think it's important to note that the international economic community looking at Canada, the OECD report, actually recommends that the health of Canada's economy would be improved if we reduce the taxes on income and payroll and put them on carbon instead. That's an international recommendation from other countries that have done the same. It's not economically disastrous. It's a smart economic thing to do. Mr. Harper, you are so out of touch with people when you can say they're not worried about losing their homes. They're not worried about making ends meet. The people who've lost their jobs in my community when Trenton Works shut down, I can tell you I meet people every single day who are worried about how they're going to keep their homes. Maybe the rich people who had enough investment that they're panicked. And they don't have to be very rich to have investments. I'm not saying that anyone who's worried right now is in a category of being out of touch. But you're out of touch if you don't know that people are fundamentally worried who've lost their jobs in industries that they could have held on to if your economic policies hadn't favored one region over others. And again, the OECD report says Canada is at risk of Dutch disease. And if we're going to avoid that, we need to have the dollar at a level that's competitive. I agree with you. We don't want to raise taxes throughout society. We want to cut income taxes because your tax package cut the wrong taxes.
Okay, let's go to
Every economist in this
just a minute, please.
It cut primarily GST. It didn't cut income tax deeply enough at all.
Mr.
Harper, I don't know how far you've changed in your views of the unemployed since the speech you gave in '97 where you said to Americans, don't feel badly about the Canadian unemployed. They're doing just fine because of our system of insurance and generous social welfare. Those programs, unemployment insurance have gone down. Workers who are unemployed are running out of their unemployment insurance. And the jobs that are being created are lower productivity, service economy jobs. The jobs that are being lost are the higher productivity, manufacturing, pulp and paper sector jobs. And that's just not my opinion. That's the conclusion. Again, I hate to tell you, you really should read the OECD report on Canada's economy because it gives you some good advice, which you seem to have ignored. We need to bring the manufacturing sector back. We need to bring the pulp and paper sector back. We need to bring back jobs that are across the country. It's not good enough for people in Nova Scotia to know they can get a job if the family's prepared to be torn apart while dad goes to work at Fort McMurray for several months. You claim to care about families. Families need jobs in the communities where they live. And a policy that allows the Canadian dollar to rise so fast that distorts the economy through the growth of the Athabasca tar sands at all costs, that loses us jobs for every industry that relies on exports and for tourism, we need to have the kinds of policies that have a national vision and a national focus. So your government that promises billions of dollars for Coast Guard vessels should build them in Canada to create jobs here. It is false economics to try to save money by building those ships in South Korea rather than giving people jobs here at home. We need a vision for an economy that focuses on what we need nationally. Again, short-term and long-term, not just looking in the rearview mirror. And that kind of vision wants to invest in Canada. I like, a Buy Canada policy makes sense. Even our Defense Department now is contracting out to get cheaper products from China when better quality products for our military are found right here in Canada. What we're seeing right now under your policies, Mr. Harper, is the most profound structural shift in our economy in more than a generation. And it's dangerous because it's unbalanced. And that's what the rest of the world sees. I don't know why you don't see it. You have to say you have every intention of not reaching a deficit. No one could make that promise. But I have to know, Mr. Harper, how it is that your Minister of Public Works, Mr. Paradis, could say that he's canceling all the contracts to build those ships for the Coast Guard and the Navy and looking at buying them overseas. That's what he announced.
Okay, let me get back on the deficit question.
So we've got some difference between you and your Minister of Public Works.
Over here, please.
We need to turn around the preoccupation with acting on climate change as though it threatens economic disaster and face what it really is. As former President Bill Clinton puts it, the climate crisis represents the single biggest economic opportunity in the history of humanity to seize the new technology technologies that make sense, to start building them here instead of importing them from countries that were ahead of us, to start recognizing that it's simply bad economics to assume that dumping pollution in the atmosphere is free, but stopping that pollution from happening has to cost. It's the other way around. So when we shift and tax those things that we don't want, like pollution, and don't tax the things we want, like income and jobs, we can move in the direction of Sweden, which has actually seen its economy grow while reducing its greenhouse gases, or Germany, that's created 400,000 new jobs in renewable energy.
Okay.
I've got to say that the only way that a carbon tax shift works, the way applied in Sweden, the way applied in Germany, the way we propose it in the Green Party, is that you reduce the taxes on the things you want in society, jobs and income, and put them onto pollution. Now, we've got a plan that would bring in $35 billion. I know that Mr. Dion's plan is only bringing in $15. So he can reduce taxes $15 billion. We can reduce them $35 billion. It's simply bad economics to pretend that dumping pollution in the atmosphere doesn't have a cost. It does. And your plan based on intensity targets was this very day the Alberta Auditor General Fred Dunn found that the Alberta plan based on intensity targets is simply not worth the money they're spending on it because it will not reduce greenhouse gases, and neither will yours. The weakest target of any country in the industrialized world, and we have the shame of being the only country in the world that ratified Kyoto that's chosen to ignore its targets. It's a shameful situation for Canada to know, for Canadian citizens to know, that our government sent our negotiators to UN conferences such as Bali and obstructed progress even more than the Bush administration. We need to look at this issue of Mr. Giuseppe's territoriality. People don't understand quite what that means, but it's a good concept because it means you work together. What we need in Canada is not what's happening now. Just as when George Bush refused to act on Kyoto, your policies have forced provincial levels, municipal levels to try to create a patchwork to make up for the absence of leadership at the federal level. And just as on health care and on any other issue, Canada works better when there's federal leadership within a framework that brings everyone on board to pull in the same direction.
Okay,
the only
Canada's
thing that you actually said that's true is the work on national parks. Well done. But everything else is a fraud.
And that's the and you learned how to say that in French last night.
I did. Fraud. Yeah. Fraud.
Okay, let's go to our third question
frauds.
now.
We're now suffering in our healthcare system from a series of decisions that were taken in the early 90s. They had to do with tough deficit cutting. Jack Layton's made this point. It caused serious damage. We lost 21% of our hospital beds between the year 93, 94, 96, 97. And that period of cutting, it actually was interesting, did not result in the savings people thought, because when you don't have the hospital beds and you cut back on the doctors, you have sicker people staying in hospital longer. Our healthcare system needs people who believe in the full public provision of health care for everyone, and we need to reinvest in that. Yes, we need to make sure our doctors don't have student debts. Yes, we need to make sure that doctors and nurses operate in this country and that we have hospital beds to meet that need. It's urgent that we invest because right now under Chapter 11 of NAFTA, U.S. private interests are trying to break down our system. I'm sorry this discussion seems to be taking place in a level of complete naivete about the pressures that exist globally to destroy our healthcare system. We have to be aware of them. We have to know them. The International Monetary Fund reported to Canada about our deficits in 93 and 94 that if we were going to be able to maintain our credit rating, we had to cut our hospital beds. That was in fact done by provinces and federal government in an invisible way that Canadians didn't see. Now we have NAFTA, Chapter 11, a suit filed by an Arizona businessman just recently to claim the right to move in to build a private clinic in Canada, because what to us is a sacred trust, a universal health care system, to the U.S. big business and very, very expensive and very poor health care system. We are a market. We have to recognize that, yes, the liberal cuts in the 90s hurt our health care system. Yes, we're seeing further pressure on our health care system. And yes, Mr. Harper, your job from 97 until you went back into politics was to destroy our health care system. You gave speeches in which you told Americans we were a failed Northern European welfare state, and proof of our inferiority was our pride in our health care system. You said that many times.
Okay, Ms. May, can I just clarify? If it's a private clinic, but the services are covered by the provincial health insurance plan, are the Greens okay with that?
No, we need to see full protection of our public health care system. As it erodes, we run the risk, as we've thrown it out in our document Vision Green, and it's now happening, the risk under Chapter 11 of U.S. for-profit medicine coming into this country are simply too great.
So would you nationalize all private clinics?
We would need to make sure that the Canadian Health Care Act is fully enforced, and provinces should do so.
But that's not answering my question. Would you nationalize all existing private clinics?
We need to ensure the Health Care Act is is enforced fully. And that's not a question of nationalizing. That's a question of living up to our legislation. Arts and culture are an essential part of a democracy. Free ability for expression, not having the support for the arts tied to an ability of government to censor what projects they like, what projects they don't. We believe that, as in the recent theories of Richard Florida, there's such a thing as a creative class. And the creative class leads to investment, leads to greater economic activity, leads to community health. So yes, it's important. It's an important industrial, it's an important economic sector to have filmmaking, to have dance and performance arts, to have our theater companies able to travel around the world. This is all critical. But arts and culture are also an essential part of who we are. And as we are overwhelmed by Hollywood and culture from the United States, we need to protect our identity as Canadians, our separate identities, our individual identities, our Canadian identity. Mr. Harper's decision to kill arts funding in 16 different programs, including such things as having climate-controlled trucks that can deliver exhibits from gallery to gallery and museum to museum, simply something that individual galleries will no longer be able to do because of your cuts. Tiny amounts of money, and yet targeted for cuts. So no, Mr. Pagan, I don't think they're barbarians. I don't think Mr. Harper personally hates the arts, nor do I think he personally supports the arts. But he has appropriated all the levers of government to one sole end, increasing his political electoral power. And he goes through this process, as your Conservative War Room has a database that knows more about the individual Canadian voter than any prime minister or political party leader ever has. And for some reason, your tacticians and strategists have decided that these mean-spirited cuts against artists will help win you votes. And that's the whole reason for these stupid cuts. Well, the memos that came out of your political offices mentioned names like Gwen Dyer and Avi Lewis as reasons that programs were cut. So if you want to deny those motivations,
hang on, guys, I'm trying to make sure that Biden and Palin don't take our audience here.
Well, it's somewhat deceptive because the rate of violent crime is not actually going up. News coverage of specific and quite horrific events tend to take a lot of attention, and that's the nature of news media and coverage. Still, we want Canadians to be secure in their homes. So our approach is that we draw a line in the sand and know that when you cross that line and commit a violent crime, the instructions to judges, the bail conditions become stricter, that we actually know what we're doing with people who have committed a violent crime. We also need to ban handguns. We need to ban semi-automatic weapons. We need to get those weapons off our streets. And we also need to recognize that rural Canadians and Indigenous people who use hunting rifles need to have a less complex, less burdensome financial system for their regulation of their control of their weapons. I want to share with you an inspiring story. There's an RCMP officer, John Kennedy, in my community, who noticed that when he was taking the statements from young offenders, he found quite often he had to write them out for them because they just weren't really functionally literate. He's now able to work full-time in an adopt-a-library program because he believes, and he's proving it, that literacy is an essential element in keeping kids out of crime. So I think we need to recognize that there are good ways to invest in our society, and that it was really, again, unfortunate and shameful that Mr. Harper's government killed $17 million in literacy programs. But let's look at what works. It's investing in our kids when they're young. Prescribing minimum sentences has been shown throughout the world as something that simply doesn't work. It doesn't deter crime. It just tends to add to the burden on other levels of government. The cost of your crime package already passed on the government of British Columbia alone is an additional $22 million because you do not want to let the judges determine those sentences. The current Young Offenders Act does allow judges to decide that a crime is sufficiently serious that a young person would face the kind of sentence if they had been an adult, but they don't get put into the same kind of facilities as hardened criminals who are adults. You need to treat young people differently. We don't let them vote yet. We don't let them drive yet. You want to put them in jail with adults. It's simply not right. The situation of Afghanistan is simply too important to deal with in a history-free zone, as Mr. Bush and Mr. Harper have done. When you look at history, you see that when the U.S. led covert mission destabilized and finally saw the occupying USSR forces withdraw, there was a vacuum, and in that time there was a humanitarian crisis and hundreds of thousands of people were killed. So the Greens come at this with a different approach. What's fair and right for the people of Afghanistan? What will work? The NATO mission isn't working. The bombardment of civilians only turns people to the Taliban. The destruction of the poppy crops only turns people to the Taliban. We need a United Nations mission that is prepared to take on Taliban, but with far more nations involved, many from Islamic backgrounds, and turn those poppies into medicinal drugs for developing countries. It's very clear that your position as leader of the opposition was to Canada should be part of the coalition of the willing. You argued it, you made the speech. Let's move on from that. The current mission is not a UN mission. The initial NATO process received a UN sanction. It's not the same thing as a UN mission. And if we're going to actually make progress to stabilize Afghanistan, we have got to ensure that it's not perceived as solely a Western nation initiative led by the U.S. That's why 2011 is too late to change the mission, but too early to leave. We need to have a United Nations mission that involves far more countries. We need to go back to do that. And by the way, you're boasting about the fact that most of our development assistance is going to Afghanistan. That's a terrible thing that's happened, is that CEDA's missions have become so politicized that we're turning our back on Africa. We're not helping the poorest of the poor. It's becoming part of our mission in Afghanistan to distort the mission on international development assistance. We need to make poverty history, and I want to know where the other leaders are on 0.7% of our GNP going to overseas development assistance. Well, first of all, Dennis, I'm really tempted to say that I'd like to do the first thing is come help you finish building the shed. But I think as a woman and a single mom, I'm really good at multitasking. So there'll be more than one thing. But top of the list is we've got to fix our electoral system. We've got to put ourselves on a path to proportional representation so that the will of the voters as expressed in the way people vote is reflected in the House of Commons. And we don't run the risk of false majorities, such as a majority of the seats with a minority of the support. We also need to move forward on the plan to deal with carbon and carbon emissions in a way that stimulates our economy, makes our future more secure. Those are top priorities for Greens. They're top priorities for 80% of Canadians who realize we have a moral obligation to the future to act.
Thank you.
I think the important thing for a Prime Minister to do in meeting with premiers and given all the distortion of the way that tax shifting works, because it was our plan originally, so I'm prepared to defend it because it's a Green Party approach, but it's been used in countries around the world. The fact of the matter is that it's exactly what we need to do right now because it helps make us more energy efficient. It helps take us away from wasteful fossil fuels, which are only going to increase in price as the supply globally of cheap, easily accessible fossil fuels dwindles. So let's do the right thing now and recognize that we do need to cut taxes where they stimulate the economy most, and those are income taxes, those are payroll taxes. And because we're cutting those taxes and we're not reducing the ability of government to run a proper system for the well-being of us all, we replace those taxes with taxes on pollution. And I want to know, Mr. Harper, we're the only party around this table, and I will put it forward because I'd love to know what you think, why we are allowing $5 billion to be taken from Canadian couples, married couples, give the government, they're forced to give the government $5 billion more than they actually owe on their income taxes because of the way married couples have to pay on their combined income. Income splitting is fairer. We can afford it because we tax carbon.
Okay, let's get
and
an
for
answer.
someone who claims to defend the institution of marriage, why do you punish people who are married? I'm a former lawyer who's become a politician, and I somehow wonder if I've dropped down to a level where I'm just slightly above the paparazzi in terms of public esteem. Politicians, not just in this country but around the world, are losing public trust. And it's because of broken promises. It's because of acting when you win an election as if you've just won the lotto and everyone else just lost, and all the people who voted for you no longer matter anymore. And the only way people are ever going to have confidence in their politicians, if you forget politicians, forget political parties, vote with what you believe in, vote with your heart, and demand better. Canadians need to be engaged in their political life, not just on voting day, but between elections. Demand better of your politicians because you don't deserve what you've got. You deserve better. I've got to say, first of all, you did ask a question, Stephen. If Jack hasn't answered, I'm going to try to answer it. The point is, yes, you can change your mind, but you've got to be honest with people what your reasons were. The reasons on the income trust never added up. There was a very strange Finance Canada calculation that ignored the tax revenue from people who receive dividends from income trusts, so the reasons didn't add up. As for the Atlantic Accord, you may have Minority Premier Rodney MacDonald agreeing with you, but let's face it, Bill Casey still doesn't, and there's reasons that I never will, because the Atlantic Accord was a contract, and it it promised Nova Scotians that equalization payments would never form part of the calculation of the revenues from offshore. And you ignored that contract. And Bill Casey showed you the legal reasoning that what you were doing was breaking a contract. He pleaded with you before he had to vote against the budget. And you ignored that because you decide that if a law is something you don't like or a contract something you don't like, you just sweep it across the table, don't you? You just decide it doesn't matter because your word is law.
Okay,
that's no way for a prime minister to behave.